Mary Talofa Bulla, hello again, and welcome to my third presentation discussing soil management activities. This one will focus on the trial work, and in case you're wondering, I haven't got my mugshot in the corner. The video's not working, so you don't have to put up with that there now. In this particular session, I'll very much focus on trial work that we've been doing. Evaluating different compost mixes has been a key component. Most of the composts are based on a standard 3:3 ratio of brown leaves to green leaves. So often that brown leaves will be Tiongol Premna or breadfruit leaves, and green leaves often that's Temau or Scaevola. Alternative composts is the one that we've been developing. So that has some of the standard leaves substituted with higher value leaves such as Vigna and drumstick, and also some seaweed, throw in a bit of ash, mature compost and rust. Pig manure is the standard 3:3 plus 1 part of pig manure. Sea cucumber, same again with 1 part of sea cucumber, and you get the picture. Liquid fertilizer, same as the first mix, and in our pot trials, then we're using a control against a control of a local soil. So here you can see the sea cucumber, and here the foliar mixed liquid fertilizer being brewed. The pot trial was with maize, conducted at Tenaya in our special shade house that was built. And these are the results. So along here we have the different composts and the weights, the dry weights. As you can see, the poultry manure stands out as the better or the best compost, followed by some of the others, sea cucumber, pig manure. The alternative wasn't quite as high yielding, but then when you look at the significant differences, it's significantly not different to these. But also it's not higher than significantly higher than the control of the liquid, which is a little disappointing until we did the soil test. The result came back afterwards and it was this crazy high numbers. So this was our comparison, the control. And so 500 milligrams per kilogram of phosphorus and 130 of potassium, and good levels of nitrogen as well. So perhaps it's not surprising that some of the compost didn't show up so favourably compared to the control. So in the future we used soil from around Tenaya, which is more similar to some of these outer island soils, which are much lower. And in terms of the compost, the analysis, the 4 composts down here. Things to look at for the manures, higher levels of the macro elements, the nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, and particularly for the poultry manure. So really good levels of potassium, which as we've discussed is one of the key ones. So perhaps that's not surprising why the potassium is doing well. In terms of the sea cucumber, probably down a little bit, or almost certainly down a little bit in trace elements, bearing in mind that this is commonly diluted. So we're diluting the compost because it gets a bit wet sometimes if it's not diluted with sand or soil. And then even in the manures, some of the trace elements are probably a touch on the low side. And of course the standout here is the alternative. So this is the rust, presumably it's the rust being added. So this is rust that has been smashed, ground up and screened. That's to increase the surface area, and then added at the start of the compost making. Now in theory that shouldn't be available, but I suspect that in the compost you've got chelating effects that are stopping the iron from being bound up or becoming unavailable. And so we've got showing up as great available iron content. So that's certainly worth an explore, which we did in subsequent trials. Composts that we made end of last year, similar, but a standard of just 3 to 3 to see how that would go as a comparison. And then much the same. And then, as I said, looking at rust being added during the mixing and an alternative compost with no rust added. Although in the pot trial, there was also some rust added after the compost had been finished and was being added to the pots. Sorry, I've got a bit of something in the throat. And of course the control, comparing the local soil, which in this case was a soil from around Tenaya. Now we had some issues setting this up, the pot trial, but a couple of Aussies having another go at it. I mentioned in an earlier talk about ash and how good that was, and also sounded a cautionary note. This was a trial, 2 trials. First one conducted at Tenaya, where we had 0, 5, 10, 15 and 20% ash by weight, and in brief, anything above 5% there was a large reduction in growth. I followed up with this with an honours student at the University of Tasmania. We had a compost mixed with soil. The soil I sourced from an island just north of Tasmania, which has a calcareous soil similar to an atoll one. In the trial there were 6 rates of ash and 6 replicates, and we grew tomatoes. Dry matter production on this axis and ash content, so we're not talking high amounts of ash based on this earlier trial. And as you can see, around 1 to 2% after that, the dry matter yields start to drop off. So it's a fairly dramatic effect, and obviously here with above 5%, we're getting significantly lower, or significantly lower in the case of the 7.3% ash, significantly lower than the nil ash. So ash in moderation. The other thing that did show up too, these were from leaf analyses. So this is tissue phosphorus. Things are going along okay here, and then starting to drop off and then getting really low. So whether there's some sort of tie-up with the ash, which is tying up the phosphorus. And of course, this ash is, it's high in calcium, magnesium, and the pH can be above 12. So it's perhaps not surprising that there are issues that can appear. The other thing too, though, is this potentially adding it at the start of the compost making as well. So with the buffering capacity in compost, using that so that there's less problems with any toxicities. On a similar theme, we also investigated biochar. I'm saying biochar. Biochar, the pyrolysis is conducted at particular temperatures. It can be a range in temperatures. We really have no control over the temperature in this. It was a 44-gallon drum that was made up to produce charcoal, but we can't really control the temperature. So it probably could be called charcoal, but I'm calling it biochar for this. I'll just take a drink. So in the initial pot trial, I should explain too about biochar. So biochar itself is kind of like a sponge for water, so it can soak up 4 times its own weight in water. It's also a sponge for nutrients as well, so that means less leaching, which obviously is a great asset for atoll soils, and it can reduce toxicity effects as well. And on top of that, it's regarded as a habitat for soil biology. So all those little holes inside the biochar are like a reef for fish, where the fish can hide, but the soil biology can hide in there as well. So in the initial trial, we had biochar at 0, 5, 10, 15 and 20%, and We crushed this biochar. You can see crushing it here and screening it just to remove the fines. I was conscious that the fines, some of that is like ash, and with the pH at 12, that wouldn't be good. All the pots had 25% by weight compost, and then there was decreasing soil with increasing biochar. The graph showing this, well, here's just one of the reps of from the trial. So you can see here that 10 to 15% biochar is the highest, and that's around 70% higher than the zero. So yeah, it's a good result. Probably because there's only 4 replicates, that's an issue. But yeah, it just needs more replicates. The other thing might be a nutrient effect, but I suspect not, mainly because we're talking fairly large quantities here with the biochar, and whereas with ash, as you saw, it was only 1 or 2% of that. So I suspect it's not a nutrient effect. We have a second pot trial ready to go. So the compost and the biochar is there, and it was meant to be conducted this year, but for obvious reasons, that hasn't happened. Now, on to another aspect of the project. You'd have heard of food cubes. This is an example. This is one. So the setup is that there's this base in the bottom. Below that is 15 centimetres of water, or up to 15 centimetres, depending on how much you have in there. These are cones that run down into the water. They're like legs, and it's through there that the soil or the growing media is able to wick up the water. So that comes up and into the soil which sits on top of here. This is through capillary action. So it's something that you might see in sand, where you've got water moving up through sand as a wave, and so it's relying on that. It's a pretty cool system because it's plant driving the amount of water that it needs, and so it tends to avoid overwatering and underwatering. Of course, there are other wicking beds, and Siwa had been evaluating some of these. This is not Tanea, but at Tanea in 2017, 2018. So here we've got a demonstration of making them on Funafala. And so you have the plastic base, an area to keep the soil from slipping down. So basically an area the water sits in amongst the rocks or the coral. And then you have a plastic, or sorry, something like this material here, the shade cloth, to stop the soil going down into the water, and then you grow on top of that. But there are other ways of doing it. So here's one being made out of apple crate. My wife actually has been making these for a couple of years. And then another one, which is similar sort of system, using the banana trunk. As you know, they're pretty moist and wet. So it's a good way of keeping the moisture up to the plants. And then this last one is a precursor, really, of the food cubes. So this is on Funafuti. So there are a few benefits of wicking beds. I mean, the big one, the one that is most applicable to atolls, is increased water use efficiency. So there's been studies done, 50% or even much higher percentage of improvement over normal watering systems. And then, of course, the other big one for atolls is reducing or no leaching of nutrients, given that you've got this tank, so the nutrients can be reused. I mean, I think at some point this system needs to be flushed out, so there might be some leaching, but very little compared to the normal situation. And then the other big advantage is being above ground, and so avoiding some of the sea surges that way. So all round, there's a lot of potential for food cubes and wicking beds in general. DFAT sent through 12 food cubes to the University of Tasmania. This was for some UTAS Masters projects with 2 students, Lanjing and Kishore. They had a 13-week project, which is not all that long, so it's a Masters by coursework. So things had to flow fairly smoothly. And in that I was helped with my colleague Dr. Deepa Kumar. She's based in Hobart with the students, and maybe it was a good experience spending most of my time away, because it'll probably be helpful setting up similar trials in the Pacific, where again I won't be around too much. So initial study was a pot trial, the initial study was to work out whether we could constitute a local sand to match an atoll sand or soil. So I mixed in 2 different sands that were available from a horticultural supply, and they had a pretty good, very similar particle size analysis that was measured with some of this equipment to a sand from Tuvalu. And then we did the pot trial to work out what were the best ratios. So given that there's only 12 food cubes, the pot trial was to work out some of the details beforehand. So we've got, in the pot trial, there were 4 rates of compost and 4 rates of coconut coir. And as the coir increased, then the sand decreased. And there was a whole lot of measurements done, and some of those, it's still being analysed, and some are showing up significant differences, but I'll focus on the food cubes for now, some of the data there. So from the pot trial, 50% compost was the best performer. And so that was, in the trial, was 0, 10, 20 and 30% coir. So the 4 treatments by just the 3 replicates, given we don't have access to a lot of food cubes. And there was a number of measurements done. Some of these are still being analysed now, and the students are busy writing up. But some of the early data, looking at soil moisture content, so this was at 10 centimetres, and looking at 0, 10, 20 and 30% coir, standout is the 30% coir. So it's been in more moisture in that growing media right from near the start of the trial, and that was a significant difference. And then looking at the water use. So the water use, mostly, I haven't got the later data, but this was over the period of top watering, and then when the top watering finished, the level, so this is actually recording the level by date, the level in the food cube started to come down with the coir, so there was obviously more water going out of those treatments, 30% coir. So whether that was through transpiration or evaporation, that shows up later. And also looking at the amount of water used, so from the level, taking that one step. So we've got the water in litres being used, so that's these bars here. And so the coir at 30% was higher than 10%. So there seems to be a bit of a trend there. With the dry matter yield, no significant difference. You can see a similar trend. And interestingly, with the fresh weights, there was a significant difference. So the differences showed up more with the 30 and the 20 being higher, relatively higher. And the effect was basically that at the 20 and 30% coir, the plants had a higher moisture content. And that was, I think, significant or very close to being significant statistically. One little bit of caution, we're also looking at electrical conductivity. So the electrical conductivity is a measure of salts, but that can be not just sodium, that can be potassium, magnesium, calcium. So all of those salts and looking at them by depth, so 3 depths, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, and 20 to 30 centimetres. So coming across here, we've got the coir treatments at 10 to 20 centimetres in the soil and 20 to 30. There's not a lot of variation, so the salt levels haven't really changed that much. But the 0 to 10, there's a trend there. Now I will point out this is not replicated data. We haven't had time, pardon me. But we'll be replicating this after the students have finished. One of them is going to stay on longer and do some extra work. So just to see whether that is an effect that's showing up with, and in effect with more wicking, that there's more salt making its way to the surface, 0 to 10 centimetres. And then interestingly, looking at the water, so the EC of the water, that's showing the opposite effect. So presumably the salts have come out of the tank water. When I say water, so that's in the reservoir water in the food cube. And so presumably making their way up to the top 0 to 10 centimetres. Now that's not actually necessarily a new effect. People have discussed that potentially as an issue in the past. It's interesting that this is showing up in the data though. So we need to have follow-up trials on that. And of course, if we have rain, then it's not a particular problem either. You know, the rain will wash at least some of it down, but that'll be interesting just to evaluate that and see how much it does wash down. And finally, an honours student has started a pot trial, and he's looking at again, a sort of a biochar trial. So it's pots with non-wicking conditions, so just normal pots as you can see here, and that'll be compared with pots with saucers. So that'll be wicking. So they'll sit in the saucer and be able to, and get the water kept up to them. So that'll be a comparison of, I've got here the 5 rates of biochar, 0, 2.5, 5, 10, and 20%, with and without wicking. So of course without the wicking, that's more similar to a normal soil. And if biochar is able to prevent some loss of water, prevent some loss of nutrients, then that's good. But you could argue that in a food cube, there may be less benefit. So we'll see that, determine that first of all, and then the next stage of the project will be to evaluate in the food cubes once the master's students have finished with those. So that's it for the trials. I just wanted to finish off now with some slides looking at future potential work. So under the category of evaluating compost and growing media inputs, there's the additional waste streams. So looking at those, testing those, and with the view of upscaling of compost production. So there's fish waste at the moment. There's piggeries and the manure. There might even be a commercial piggery being set up. And the other big one is council green waste. So it's all about having more of a circular economy and utilising these resources rather than wasting them. Similarly, looking at the manures as well. So manure-based compost and trying to improve the manure inputs that come in. So if the diet is good or better, then it's more likely the manure will be better as well. So if we're able to develop a better formulation of ration, and I have thought, we could utilise a ration based on the, we'll come to this a bit later on, but utilising a ration based on coconut and the leaves. But there's also better capture of manure. So at the moment, a lot of pigs are tethered, so that manure and urine is running down, and then of course there's the issues with that contaminating the freshwater lands as well. So encouraging means of collecting that with a base in the pen. Evaluating inputs for ability to improve some of the physical properties such as water holding capacity. So that I've mentioned biochar and coconut coir, and also substitutes for clay as well. So testing in the atolls. And then the last 3 points relate to more specifically the rust and ash. So continuing some of the work there to determine how useful that is. What are the benefits from the rust? And I'm assuming that if we add to the compost at the start, it's better, but to clarify that, we've got the 1 pot trial to be finished on that. And with ash, similarly. So look at that again under atoll conditions, whether adding it at the start of the compost making is beneficial. And also extracting nutrients from the ash as well, so particularly the potassium. So I've said previously how high the potassium levels are in the coconut husks and shells that have been burnt. Now, is there a way of extracting that, but leaving behind the sodium in particular, and also the magnesium as well, magnesium and calcium. A couple other points. Encouraging a more holistic farming approach, so that's integrating cover crops, specific plantings, so that for trees and bushes that are used for compost and used for mulch along the lines of alley cropping, incorporating fruit trees and having more animals in the system. And this is covered to some degree by our Babai food garden model as well, which my colleague Graham Lyons will discuss in his presentation. But yeah, there's similar sorts of ideas where we're integrating a lot of components. And then I mentioned just a little while ago about developing rations for animals based on coconut, and also using our knowledge on what are the most appropriate leaves as well. And when we have that information of leaves for human consumption with Graham and myself from the compost side of things, it wouldn't take much to say, right, well, this could be useful for the animals. These are the leaves we add to top up, and maybe even ash as a salt lick. Increased capacity building and extension activities. So we need to provide more opportunity for atoll-specific training, so courses and online. So there's a dearth of information specifically relating to atolls. Another point is soil tests. It'd be good to do research higher degree, a master's or a PhD student looking at local nutrient emission trials. So this is where you're adding nutrients systematically and then leaving one out to see what's limiting growth. And then some additional local publications, fact sheets. So we've got the best bet compost recommendations, but a refinement of that after we finish the pot trials. And there's some other fact sheets that were not quite finished. So nutrient deficiency symptoms, a nutrient recycling fact sheet, and another one on trial protocols. So there's a couple of fact sheets already out on the composting and soil management side of things. And then in addition to those, there's also been recommendations made for IFAD and Tuvalu Food Futures. And finally, evaluating alternative food production systems, so not just food cubes. So with the food cubes, looking at the growing media and soil-water interactions and nutrient movement in particular, and how we top up the nutrients as well. But also looking at more basic systems and even the concrete block palaka pits and maybe hydroponics as well. Finally, extending these results from this project to other atolls, and for myself personally, I've really got to make time to publish a paper on targeted composting. So thank you very much for listening in, and a special thank you to all of my hardworking colleagues. We've worked through some pretty tough and hard times physically, and through it we've achieved some good results. You're great people, and Vanaka Vaka level. Mode. And yeah, sorry for my squeaky voice. If I get a chance, I'll re-record it